The static crackled through the command center speakers like broken glass, each pop and hiss magnifying the silence that had stretched for 47 minutes. Colonel Marcus Hartwell stared at the tactical display, watching the red dots representing enemy positions remain stubbornly motionless while his own forces sat in holding patterns, burning fuel and burning time. The operation had been called off at 3:47 hours when their primary strike package encountered unexpected surface-to-air missile sites that intelligence had somehow missed. 24 F-16s had turned back, their payloads still hung beneath their wings, their pilots frustrated and their targets still breathing. But Ghost 7 hadn't turned back. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Williams, adjusted his headset for the 100th time, his fingers dancing across frequency dials like a pianist searching for the right key. Nothing. Static. The kind of empty air that made senior officers question their decisions and junior officers question their futures. Ghost 7 had gone dark somewhere over the Kandahar province, and with her had gone their last hope of eliminating a high-value target that had been ghosting coalition forces for 18 months. "Sir," Williams finally spoke, his voice cutting through the humid tension of the underground command center. "I'm getting something on the emergency frequency." Hartwell's head snapped up from the intelligence briefing he'd been pretending to read. The other officers in the room, Major Davidson from Intelligence, Captain Rodriguez from Operations, and Lieutenant Colonel Barnes from Air Support, all turned toward the radio station like flowers following the sun. They'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, preparing for the worst while hopping for the impossible. The transmission was weak, buried under layers of atmospheric interference and the digital hash of enemy jamming systems. But it was there. A human voice, female, calm as morning coffee despite being broadcast from what everyone in the room knew was likely a hostile environment. "Ghost 7 to Blackbird Base." Williams's eyes widened. He'd been expecting a distress call, a mayday, or worse, silence followed by the kind of intelligence reports that ended careers and started investigations. Instead, the voice on the radio sounded like someone ordering lunch. "Ghost 7, this is Blackbird Base. Authenticate your position and status," Williams responded, his training overriding his surprise. "Blackbird Base, Ghost 7. Authentication Charlie 77 Delta. Position." A pause, static. Then, "Objective complete. Repeat, objective complete. Request permission to return to base." The room erupted in whispers and shuffled papers, but Hartwell raised his hand for silence. Something was wrong. Not bad wrong, just different. Ghost 7 was supposed to be Major Elena Vasquez, a pilot who'd been flying combat missions for 3 years without so much as a distinguished flying cross to show for it. Good pilot, solid record, but nothing that would suggest she'd complete a mission that an entire strike package had deemed impossible. Yet here she was, claiming mission success when she should have been either dead or running for her life. Major Davidson leaned forward, his intelligence officer instincts kicking in. "Sir, we need to verify this. The target was confirmed alive as of 400 hours." "Ghost 7, Hartwell spoke into his headset, "describe your target engagement." The response came back steady and professional. "Blackbird Base, target was neutralized at 3:52 hours via precision-guided munition. Secondary explosions confirmed destruction of ammunition cache and communications equipment. Area is secure." But Elena Vasquez, Coulson Ghost 7, was more than just another pilot checking boxes on a mission brief. She was the daughter of a Marine who died in Fallujah, the granddaughter of a bomber pilot who'd flown over Europe in 1944, and the great-granddaughter of a woman who'd ferried aircraft during World War II when the military still believed women couldn't handle combat aircraft. She'd grown up in base housing, eating in mess halls, learning to read using aircraft identification manuals as picture books. What the men in the command center didn't know, what they couldn't have known because Elena had never told them, was that she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Not this specific mission, but this type of moment. The moment when everything the military had taught her about precision, timing, and executing under pressure would either save lives or cost them. The F-16C Fighting Falcon she'd been flying that morning was tail number 880416, a aircraft that had seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. It was 23 years old, had logged over 4,000 flight hours, and had a reputation among maintainers for being temperamental about its engine temperature readings. Alina had been assigned to this particular aircraft, not because it was the best available, but because she was junior enough that she got whatever was left after the more senior pilots made their selections. But she'd learned to love that airplane the way some people learn to love difficult relatives, with patience, understanding, and a healthy respect for its quirks. She knew that it pulled slightly to the left during high G turns, that its radar display flickered in cold weather, and that its air conditioning system had been broken for 6 months. She also knew that it was fast, maneuverable, and deadly accurate when handled properly. The target she'd been assigned, officially designated HVT-27 in the intelligence briefs, was a Taliban commander named Qasim al-Rashid who'd been responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. He'd been tracked to a compound in the mountains north of Kandahar, a location that satellite imagery suggested was heavily fortified and well defended. When the primary strike package encountered the unexpected SAM sites, the mission commander had made the correct tactical decision: abort the mission and return to base. The surface-to-air missiles were a game-changer, turning what should have been a routine strike mission into a potential disaster that could cost aircraft and lives. Alina had been flying in the number 4 position, far enough back in the formation that she'd had time to analyze the situation before the abort order came through. She'd seen the SAM sites activate their targeting radars, watched as the lead aircraft began evasive maneuvers, and listened to the radio chatter as the mission commander weighed options and made his decision. But she'd also seen something else: a gap in the enemy's defensive coverage, a corridor of airspace that might allow a single aircraft to reach the target while the defenders were focused on the larger formation heading away from the area. The decision she'd made in that moment would define her career and possibly her life. Instead of following the rest of the formation home, she'd broken off and headed deeper into enemy territory, alone, flying a route that existed only in her mind, and depending on skills that had been honed over thousands of hours of training and hundreds of hours of combat. The compound materialized through her heads-up display exactly where intelligence said it would be: a cluster of buildings surrounded by walls and defensive positions, nestled in a valley that made approach difficult and escape even more challenging. Alina had one chance to get this right, one missile to put exactly where it needed to go, and one opportunity to get back to friendly airspace before the enemy realized what had happened. She'd lined up her approach from the southeast, using the mountains as cover until the last possible moment. The laser-guided bomb had come off her aircraft clean, tracking straight and true toward the building where intelligence believed the target was located. She'd watched it impact, seen the secondary explosions that suggested the intelligence about an ammunition cache had been correct, and then she'd turned for home. The flight back had been a masterclass in low-level navigation and threat avoidance. Alina had kept her aircraft below the radar horizon, using terrain features to mask her signature and timing her route to avoid known air defense positions. She'd flown through valleys she'd memorized from satellite photos, over ridgelines she'd studied on topographical maps, and past villages whose names she'd learned to pronounce correctly. By the time she'd reached the radio range to contact base, the adrenaline had faded enough for her to process what had happened. She completed a mission that a full strike package had deemed too dangerous to attempt. She'd done it alone, in an aircraft that other pilots considered substandard, using skills that her instructors had always praised but her peers had never seemed to notice. The radio crackled again, pulling everyone in the command center back to the present moment. Blackbird Base, Ghost 7, requesting landing clearance. Fuel state is manageable. Colonel Hartwell looked around the room at his staff officers, seeing his own questions reflected in their faces. How had she done it? Why had she done it? And most importantly, what were they going to do about it? Ghost 7, you are cleared to land on runway 27. Emergency services will be standing by. Negative on emergency services, Blackbird Base. Aircraft is undamaged and pilot is uninjured. Standard approach requested. There was something in her voice, not arrogance exactly, but a quiet confidence that suggested she'd never doubted the outcome of her mission. It was the voice of someone who'd done exactly what she'd set out to do, nothing more and nothing less. Major Davidson was already on his secure phone, calling back to intelligence headquarters to confirm the target's status. Captain Rodriguez was updating the mission logs, trying to figure out how to document what had happened. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was staring at the tactical display, tracing the route Ghost 7 would have had to take to reach the target and return. But Colonel Hartwell was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about the last time he'd heard that tone of voice from a pilot, that calm professionalism that came from someone who just accomplished something significant and was trying not to make a big deal about it. It had been 12 years ago, in Iraq, when a young F-16 pilot named Jake Morrison had taken out an enemy anti-aircraft site that was threatening a helicopter rescue mission. Morrison had done it alone, against orders, using tactics that weren't in any manual but that had saved the lives of 6 American soldiers. Morrison had been court-martialed for disobeying orders, then quietly awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross 6 months later when the full story became clear. He'd gone on to become one of the most respected pilots in the Air Force, a squadron commander who trained a generation of younger pilots in the art of thinking independently while still following orders. Elena Vasquez might be facing a similar crossroads. What she'd done was either brilliant or reckless, depending on how you looked at it. She'd either saved the mission or needlessly endangered herself and her aircraft. She'd either shown the kind of initiative that the military needed or the kind of insubordination that it couldn't tolerate. The answer would depend on what intelligence found when they investigated the target site, on what her squadron commander decided to put in his report, and on what the bureaucrats back at headquarters decided to do with a pilot who'd succeeded where others had failed. The sound of jet engines grew louder outside the command center, and Colonel Hartwell realized that Ghost 7 was on final approach. In a few minutes, Major Elena Vasquez would be walking through the door, and he'd have to decide whether to congratulate her or arrest her. Maybe both. Staff Sergeant Williams was monitoring the tower frequency, listening to the routine communications between the air traffic controller and the approaching aircraft. Ghost 7, runway 27, cleared to land, winds calm. Tower Ghost 7, cleared to land runway 27. The voice was still calm, still professional, but there was something else now. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. The sound of someone who'd taken an enormous risk and lived to tell about it. Through the reinforced windows of the command center, they could see the F-16 settling onto the runway, its drag chute deploying behind it like a white flower blooming in the desert heat. The aircraft taxied clear of the runway and toward the parking area, where a ground crew was already waiting with chocks and power carts. Colonel Hartwell stood up, straightening his uniform and trying to decide what his first words to Major Vasquez should be. Congratulations, explanations, orders to report to his office for a formal debriefing. "Sir," Major Davidson said, hanging up his secure phone, "intelligence confirms the target is down. Satellite imagery shows the compound is destroyed, and signals intelligence has lost all communications from that location. And the target himself." "Confirmed, KIA. Qasim al-Rashid is dead." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not the tense waiting of 47 minutes ago, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Ghost 7 had delivered on her promise. The mission was complete. Outside, the F-16's engine wound down with a whistle that every pilot recognized as the sound of coming home. Soon, Major Elena Vasquez would be walking across the tarmac, removing her helmet, and beginning the process of explaining how she'd accomplished something that everyone else had deemed impossible. But for now, Colonel Hartwell was content to watch through the window as the ground crew began their post-flight inspection of the aircraft. Whatever happened next, whatever questions needed to be answered, and reports needed to be filed, Ghost 7 had earned her place in the story. She'd turned a failed mission into a success, and in the process, she'd probably changed the trajectory of her own career. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. Nobody would ever again question whether Elena Vasquez belonged in a cockpit. The command center door opened, and Colonel Hartwell turned to see Major Vasquez enter, her helmet tucked under her arm and her flight suit still bearing the creases from her ejection seat. She looked exactly like what she was, a pilot who just completed a difficult mission and was ready to move on to the next one. "Sir," she said, snapping to attention, "Major Vasquez reporting as ordered." Colonel Hartwell studied her face, looking for signs of stress or fatigue or the kind of adrenaline crash that often followed dangerous missions. What he saw instead was a pilot who'd done her job and was waiting for further instructions. "Major," he said finally, "I think we need to talk." Elena Vasquez had been born Elena Rosa Vasquez at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the daughter of Staff Sergeant Carlos Vasquez, a Marine Corps mechanic, and Captain Patricia Vasquez, an Air Force logistics officer. Her childhood had been spent moving from base to base, school to school, always the new kid whose father worked on airplanes and whose mother planned missions. She'd learned to read using aircraft identification cards, had done her homework in base libraries surrounded by technical manuals and after-action reports, and had fallen asleep every night to the sound of aircraft taking off and landing. By the time she was 10 years old, she could identify most military aircraft by their engine sounds alone. Her father had died in an IED explosion outside Fallujah when she was 16, and her mother had transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon to finish raising her daughter. Elena had spent her senior year of high school in Northern Virginia, surrounded by the monuments and memorials of a capital city that took its military seriously. She'd applied to the Air Force Academy during her senior year, not because she'd always dreamed of being a pilot, but because she'd always dreamed of being useful. Flying seemed like the most direct way to contribute to something larger than herself, and the military had been the only life she'd ever known. The academy had been 4 years of engineering courses, military training, and flight instruction. Elena had graduated in the middle of her class academically, but at the top in pilot training. She'd been assigned to F-16s not because she'd requested them, but because she'd scored well on the tests that measured spatial reasoning and multitasking ability. Her first assignment had been to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, where she'd spent 8 months learning to fly the F-16 and another 4 months learning to employ it in combat. She'd been a competent student, reliable and thorough, but nothing about her training record suggested she'd become anything more than a solid, dependable pilot. Her first deployment had been to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, where she'd flown close air support missions for ground forces operating in the mountains. She'd been good at it, patient, precise, and unflappable under pressure, but she'd never been the pilot who got the difficult missions or the high-profile targets. She'd been the pilot who got the routine missions, the ones that required competence rather than brilliance, reliability rather than innovation. She'd been the pilot who flew when someone else was sick, who took the aircraft that someone else didn't want, who filled in gaps in the schedule rather than creating new possibilities. But she'd also been the pilot who'd studied every aspect of air-to-ground combat, who'd memorized the technical specifications of every weapon system, who'd practiced emergency procedures until they were as natural as breathing. She'd been preparing for the moment when competence and preparation would matter more than reputation and politics. That moment had arrived at 3:47 hours on a Tuesday morning in the mountains of Afghanistan, when the primary strike package had encountered unexpected defenses, and the mission commander had made the decision to abort. Alina had been flying in the number 4 position, far enough back to see the tactical situation clearly, close enough to the target to make a difference. Her decision to break off from the formation and continue to the target had been made in milliseconds, based on training and instinct, and a calculation that the odds of success were better than the odds of failure. She'd seen the gap in the enemy's defensive coverage, understood the geometry of the approach, and realized that a single aircraft might accomplish what 24 aircraft could not. The next 45 minutes had been a test of everything she'd learned about flying, fighting, and surviving in hostile airspace. She'd navigated by landmarks she'd memorized from satellite photos, avoided threats she'd studied on intelligence briefings, and delivered her weapon with the precision that came from thousands of hours of training. The flight home had been equally challenging, requiring her to stay below enemy radar while conserving fuel and avoiding the kind of mistakes that could turn success into disaster. She'd flown through valleys she'd never seen before, over terrain that existed only in her mind as contour lines on a map, guided by a GPS system and her own sense of direction. By the time she'd reached radio range to contact base, she'd already begun the mental process of transitioning from combat pilot to military officer. She'd accomplished the mission, but now she had to explain how and why she'd done it. She had to account for her actions to superiors who might not understand the tactical situation she'd faced or the decisions she'd made. The radio call, Ghost 7 to Blackbird Base, objective complete, been the beginning of that process. Professional, concise, and confident, it had communicated success without bragging, competence without arrogance. It had been the voice of a pilot who'd done her job and was ready to move on to the next one. But Alina knew that the real test was just beginning. She'd have to explain her actions to her squadron commander, justify her decisions to intelligence officers, and probably face questions from investigators who'd want to know why she'd broken off from the formation and continued to the target alone. She'd have to document every aspect of the mission, from her initial assessment of the tactical situation to her final approach to the target. She'd have to explain how she'd navigated through enemy airspace, how she'd avoided detection, and how she delivered her weapon with the precision required to eliminate a high-value target. Most importantly, she'd have to convince her superiors that her actions had been motivated by military duty rather than personal ambition, that she'd been focused on accomplishing the mission rather than making a name for herself. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Her career, her reputation, and her future assignments all depended on how well she handled the next few hours. She'd have to be honest about her motivations, accurate about her tactical assessment, and convincing about her judgment. She'd have to demonstrate that she was a professional pilot who'd made difficult decisions for the right reasons. But Alina Vasquez was ready for that challenge. She'd been preparing for it her entire career, learning to think independently while still following orders, to take initiative while still respecting authority, to make difficult decisions while still accepting responsibility for the consequences. She'd proven herself in the cockpit, and now she had to prove herself in the debriefing room. The meeting would determine whether she was viewed as a hero or a problem, whether her actions were seen as exemplary or inappropriate, whether she was ready for promotion or needed additional training. But whatever the outcome, she'd already accomplished something significant. She'd shown that one pilot with the right skills and the right mindset could make a difference when it mattered most. The command center had been buzzing with activity for the past hour, as officers from various departments gathered to discuss the implications of Ghost 7's mission. Intelligence analysts were reviewing satellite imagery of the target area, operations officers were updating mission logs, and maintenance personnel were conducting a thorough inspection of Major Vasquez's aircraft. The F-16 had returned from the mission in perfect condition, with no battle damage and no mechanical problems. The aircraft's systems had performed flawlessly, and the pilot had handled it with the skill and precision that came from hundreds of hours of training and experience. The successful completion of the mission had been a testament to both the capabilities of the aircraft and the competence of the pilot. But the mission had also raised questions about standard operating procedures, tactical doctrine, and the decision-making process that had led to the initial abort order. If a single pilot could accomplish what an entire strike package could not, then perhaps the military needed to reconsider its approach to similar missions. The surface-to-air missile sites that had forced the abort of the primary mission were still active, still capable of threatening coalition aircraft. The enemy's air defense network was still intact, still capable of countering large formations of aircraft. The tactical situation that had made the original mission impossible hadn't changed. What had changed was the understanding of how that tactical situation could be overcome. Major Vasquez had demonstrated that unconventional approaches could succeed where conventional tactics failed, that individual initiative could accomplish what coordinated efforts could not, that the right pilot in the right aircraft could achieve results that seemed impossible. The lesson was significant, but it was also dangerous. If other pilots tried to emulate Major Vasquez's example without her skills or her preparation, they might find themselves shot down or captured. The tactics that had worked for her might not work for others, and the risks that had been manageable for her might be insurmountable for less capable pilots. The military would have to find a way to incorporate the lessons of Ghost 7's mission into its training programs and tactical doctrine, without encouraging reckless behavior. It would have to identify the factors that had made her success possible and develop ways to replicate those factors in other situations. That process would begin with the debriefing, where Major Vasquez would explain her decision-making process, her tactical assessment, and her execution of the mission. Her explanations would be analyzed, documented, and distributed to training commands and operational units throughout the Air Force. But the process would also depend on the military's willingness to recognize that exceptional situations sometimes required exceptional responses, that rigid adherence to procedures could sometimes prevent the accomplishment of missions, and that individual initiative could sometimes achieve results that coordinated efforts could not. Major Vasquez had proven that one pilot could make a difference, but the military would have to decide whether that was a lesson to be embraced or a precedent to be discouraged. The decision would depend on how well she explained her actions, how convincingly she demonstrated her judgment, and how effectively she showed that her success had been the result of skill rather than luck. The stakes were high, not just for Major Vasquez but for the entire Air Force. Her mission had demonstrated capabilities that could change the way the military approached similar situations, but it had also raised questions about discipline, authority, and the balance between individual initiative and collective action. The debriefing would be crucial, not just for evaluating Major Vasquez's actions, but for determining how the military learned from her experience. The lessons of Ghost 7's mission could improve the effectiveness of future operations, but only if they were understood correctly and applied appropriately. Colonel Hartwell was aware of all these implications as he prepared for the meeting with Major Vasquez. He'd have to balance the need for discipline with the need for initiative, the importance of following procedures with the importance of accomplishing missions, the value of individual achievement with the necessity of collective action. The conversation would be recorded, transcribed, and forwarded to higher headquarters for review. The conclusions reached would influence policy decisions, training programs, and tactical doctrine. The evaluation of Major Vasquez's actions would have consequences that extended far beyond her own career. But first, Hartwell had to understand exactly what had happened and why. He had to get the complete story from the pilot who'd lived it, the full picture of how one F-16 and one pilot had accomplished what 24 aircraft and 24 pilots had been unable to do. The meeting was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, and Major Vasquez was already waiting in the outer office. She'd changed out of her flight suit into her service uniform, had reviewed her notes from the mission, and was ready to explain her actions to her superiors. The next hour would determine the trajectory of her career, the evaluation of her judgment, and the lessons that the military would learn from her experience. She'd have to be honest about her motivations, accurate about her tactical assessment, and convincing about her decision-making process. But she was ready for that challenge. She'd been preparing for it her entire career, and now she had the opportunity to demonstrate that she was more than just another pilot. She was a professional who'd made difficult decisions for the right reasons, who'd taken calculated risks to accomplish important missions, and who'd proven that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. The door to Colonel Hartwell's office opened, and Major Vasquez was invited inside. The debriefing was about to begin, and with it, the next chapter in the story of Ghost 7. Alina entered the office with the measured stride of a pilot who'd learned to project confidence even when facing uncertain outcomes. The room was exactly what she'd expected: functional furniture, military memorabilia, and the kind of austere efficiency that marked career officers who'd spent more time in combat zones than in comfortable offices. Colonel Hartwell gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Alina sat down with the precise posture that had been drilled into her during her academy years. To her left sat Major Rebecca Chen, her squadron commander, whose expression was carefully neutral. To her right was Captain James Morrison, the intelligence officer who'd briefed the original mission. "Major Vasquez," Colonel Hartwell began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd conducted hundreds of similar meetings. "I want you to walk me through your mission from the moment you took off until the moment you landed. Leave nothing out." Alina had rehearsed this moment during her flight home, organizing her thoughts and preparing her explanations. She knew that every word would be analyzed, every decision questioned, every judgment evaluated. The next 30 minutes would determine whether she was viewed as a hero or a problem. "Sir, I launched at 3:15 hours as number 4 in a 4-ship formation led by Major Collins. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited, no significant winds. Our target was a compound in the mountains north of Kandahar, believed to be occupied by HVT-27, Qasim al-Rashid." She paused, gathering her thoughts. At approximately 3:47 hours, the formation encountered surface-to-air missile sites that had not been identified in the intelligence briefing. The lead aircraft detected multiple radar locks, and Major Collins made the decision to abort the mission. "But you didn't abort," Colonel Hartwell observed. "No, sir. I assessed the tactical situation and determined that a single aircraft might be able to penetrate the defenses using an alternate approach route." Major Chen leaned forward. "Major Vasquez, you were ordered to return to base with the rest of the formation. Why did you disobey that order?" Alina had expected this question, had prepared for it, but it still felt like a physical blow. The word disobey hung in the air like an accusation, a challenge to her professionalism and her judgment. "Ma'am, I interpreted the mission commander's intent to be the destruction of the target and the elimination of HVT-27. The abort order was issued because the planned approach was no longer viable, not because the mission objective had changed." "That's an interesting interpretation," Colonel Hartwell said dryly. "Explain your tactical assessment." Alina reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded map that she'd marked during her flight home. She spread it on the colonel's desk, pointing to the various features she'd identified. The SAM sites were positioned to counter a coordinated attack from the south, which was our planned approach. But they had limited coverage to the southeast, where the terrain provides natural masking. I calculated that a single aircraft could approach from this direction, deliver ordnance on target, and egress before the air defense systems could effectively respond. Captain Morrison studied the map, his intelligence officer's mind working through the tactical implications. "Major, how did you identify this gap in the coverage? It wasn't in any of our intelligence assessments." "Sir, I'd spent considerable time studying the target area using satellite imagery and topographical maps. I'd identified several potential approach routes as part of my mission preparation, including this southeastern approach that would take advantage of the terrain masking." "Why didn't you share this information during the mission briefing?" Morrison asked. Alina felt the weight of the question. This was the moment when she'd have to explain why she'd kept her tactical insights to herself, why she hadn't spoken up during the planning process. "Sir, I was the most junior pilot in the formation. The mission planning had been conducted by officers with more experience and better access to intelligence resources. I assumed that if the southeastern approach was viable, it would have been included in the primary plan." Colonel Hartwell nodded slowly. He understood the dynamics of military hierarchy, the reluctance of junior officers to question the decisions of their superiors. But he also understood that sometimes the newest perspective could see possibilities that experience might overlook. "Continue with your tactical assessment," he said. Alina pointed to the map again. The southeastern approach would require flying through this valley system, staying below the radar horizon until reaching the target area. The route is longer than the direct approach, but it avoids the known SAM sites and takes advantage of the terrain masking. "What about your fuel situation?" Major Chen asked. "The longer route would have consumed more fuel." "Yes, ma'am. I calculated that I had sufficient fuel for the extended route plus a reasonable reserve for the return flight. The fuel consumption was within acceptable parameters for a single aircraft." "And your confidence in the target intelligence?" Morrison asked. "Sir, the intelligence indicated that HVT-27 was likely to be in the compound, based on communications intercepts and human intelligence sources. The target was time-sensitive, and the opportunity to eliminate him might not have presented itself again." Colonel Hartwell studied the map, tracing the route that Alina had marked. It was unconventional, challenging, and potentially dangerous. But it was also tactically sound, taking advantage of terrain features and enemy limitations in ways that showed sophisticated understanding of air-to-ground operations. "Walk me through your approach to the target," he said. Alina's voice became more confident as she described the technical aspects of the mission. "I entered the valley system at approximately 500 feet above ground level, using the GPS navigation system and visual landmarks to maintain position. I avoided the known defensive positions by staying in the radar shadow of the ridgelines." "How did you identify the target building?" Morrison asked. "Sir, the compound matched the satellite imagery exactly. The target building was the largest structure in the complex, consistent with the intelligence assessment that it served as a command and control center." "Describe your weapon delivery." "I used a single GBU-12 laser-guided bomb, released from a range of approximately 2 miles. The laser designator provided continuous guidance until impact. The weapon detonated in the center of the target building, and I observed secondary explosions consistent with the intelligence assessment of an ammunition cache." "And your egress?" "I departed the target area immediately after weapon impact, following a different route to avoid potential air defense response. I maintained low altitude until reaching friendly airspace, then climbed to cruising altitude for the return flight. The room was quiet for a moment as the three officers absorbed the details of Alina's account. Her explanation was clear, professional, and technically accurate. She demonstrated understanding of the tactical situation, sound judgment in her decision-making, and competent execution of a complex mission. But questions remained. Colonel Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying the young pilot who'd accomplished something that should have been impossible. "Major Vasquez," he said finally, "you've described a textbook precision strike mission, but you've also described a violation of standing orders and established procedures. Help me understand why you thought that was appropriate." Alina had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long flight home. She'd have to explain her motivations, her thought process, and her understanding of military duty without sounding insubordinate or arrogant. "Sir, I believe that the mission objective was still achievable using alternate tactics. The target was time-sensitive, and the opportunity to eliminate HVT-27 might not have presented itself again. I assess the risks as manageable and the potential benefits as significant." But you made that assessment independently, without consulting your superior officers or requesting permission to deviate from the flight plan. "Yes, sir. The tactical situation was developing rapidly, and there wasn't time for extended consultation. I had to make a decision based on my assessment of the immediate circumstances." Major Chen spoke up. "Major Vasquez, you understand that your actions could have resulted in the loss of an aircraft and the capture or death of a pilot. How do you justify taking those risks?" Alina met her squadron commander's gaze directly. "Ma'am, I assess the risks as acceptable given the importance of the target and the tactical situation. My preparation and training had equipped me to handle the challenges of the mission, and I believed that the odds of success were better than the odds of failure." "But you could have been wrong," Chen pressed. "You could have been shot down, captured, or killed. How would you have explained that to the families of the other pilots who might have been sent to rescue you?" It was a hard question, one that cut to the heart of military decision-making. Alina had to acknowledge the risks while defending her judgment, had to show that she'd considered the consequences while still believing her actions were justified. "Ma'am, I understood the risks, but I also understood that HVT-27 had been responsible for attacks that had killed and wounded American soldiers. The opportunity to eliminate him was worth the risks involved, especially given my assessment that the mission was achievable." Colonel Hartwell studied her for a long moment. "Major, I want you to understand something. What you did was either brilliant or reckless, depending on how you look at it. You either saved the mission or needlessly endangered yourself and your aircraft. The difference comes down to judgment, preparation, and execution." "Yes, sir. Based on your description, it sounds like you made good tactical decisions based on solid preparation and executed them with competence. But the fact remains that you violated orders and acted independently in a situation where coordination and discipline are normally paramount." Alina nodded. "I understand, sir. The question now is what we do about it. We can't encourage pilots to freelance and ignore orders whenever they think they have a better idea. But we also can't ignore the fact that you accomplished something that the entire strike package couldn't do." He paused, looking at the map that still lay spread across his desk. "Major Vasquez, I'm going to recommend you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Your actions demonstrated exceptional skill, sound judgment, and dedication to the mission. You accomplished a significant military objective under challenging circumstances." Alina felt a surge of relief, but Colonel Hartwell wasn't finished. "However, I'm also going to recommend that you receive additional training in mission planning and coordination. You need to understand that even good ideas need to be communicated and coordinated with other units. Your tactical insights could have been valuable to the entire strike package, if they've been shared during the planning process. Yes, sir, I understand. Finally, I'm going to recommend that you be considered for assignment to a more challenging position where your skills can be better utilized. You've demonstrated capabilities that have been underutilized in your current assignment. Major Chen looked surprised. Sir, Major Vasquez is a valuable member of my squadron. I'd prefer to keep her in her current position. I understand your position, Major Chen, but Major Vasquez has shown that she's ready for greater responsibilities. The Air Force needs pilots who can think independently and act decisively. She's demonstrated both of those qualities. Alina remained silent, but she felt the weight of the moment. Her career was about to change, possibly in ways she'd never imagined. The mission that had begun as a routine strike had become a turning point that would determine her future in the Air Force. Major Vasquez, Colonel Hartwell continued, you'll be debriefed by intelligence officers who will want to understand every aspect of your mission. Your tactical innovations will be studied and possibly incorporated into training programs. Your experience will be documented and shared with other units. Yes, sir. But more importantly, you'll be expected to continue performing at the level you've demonstrated. This mission has established a new standard for your performance, and you'll be expected to maintain that standard in future assignments. Alina understood the implications. Success brought opportunities, but it also brought expectations. She'd proven that she was capable of more than routine missions, but that meant she'd be expected to handle more challenging assignments. I understand, sir. Good. Major Chen, please arrange for Major Vasquez to be debriefed by intelligence and to complete her after-action report. I want a comprehensive document that captures every aspect of this mission. Yes, sir. Colonel Hartwell stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Alina and the other officers rose to attention. Major Vasquez, he said, you've accomplished something significant today. You've shown that individual initiative and tactical innovation can achieve results that conventional approaches cannot. That's a valuable lesson for the entire Air Force. Thank you, sir. But remember that with recognition comes responsibility. You'll be expected to continue performing at this level, and you'll be expected to share your knowledge with other pilots. The Air Force is investing in your development, and we expect that investment to pay dividends. Alina saluted. Yes, sir, I won't let you down. As she left the office, Alina felt the weight of what had just happened. Her career had changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. The mission that had begun as a routine strike had become a defining moment that would shape her future in the Air Force. But she also felt a sense of satisfaction. She'd proven herself under pressure, had demonstrated capabilities that others had underestimated, and had accomplished something that would make a difference in the war effort. The risks had been real, but the results had been worth it. The next few days would bring more debriefings, more questions, and more attention than she'd ever experienced. But Alina Vasquez, Callsign Ghost 7, was ready for whatever came next. She'd proven that she belonged in the cockpit, and now she had the opportunity to prove that she belonged in positions of greater responsibility. The mission was complete, but the story was just beginning. The intelligence debriefing lasted for 3 hours, conducted in a windowless room deep within the secure section of the base. Alina sat at a metal table across from 2 intelligence officers who'd flown in from Bagram specifically to interview her about the mission. Between them lay a digital recorder, several maps, and a stack of satellite photographs that showed the target area before and after the attack. Captain Lisa Warren, the senior intelligence officer, had been analyzing Taliban command structures for 2 years. She understood the significance of eliminating Qasim al-Rashid, knew how his death would disrupt enemy operations throughout the region. But she also understood that the methods used to accomplish that elimination would have implications far beyond a single mission. Major Vasquez, she began, I want you to understand that what you accomplished today was strategically significant. Qasim al-Rashid had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces for 18 months. His elimination will save American lives. Elena nodded. I understand, ma'am. But I also want you to understand that your tactical approach was unconventional. We need to document every aspect of your mission so that we can understand how you succeeded where others failed. The questions were detailed and technical, covering every aspect of the mission from her initial tactical assessment to her final weapon delivery. Warren wanted to understand her decision-making process, her route planning, and her execution of the attack. She wanted to know how Elena had identified the gap in the enemy's defenses, how she'd navigated through hostile territory, and how she'd achieved the precision required to eliminate a specific target. Walk me through your approach to the target area, Warren said, spreading a topographical map across the table. Elena traced her route with her finger, explaining how she'd used terrain features to mask her approach. I entered the valley system here, flying at approximately 500 feet above ground level. The ridgelines provided natural screening from the radar sites positioned to the north and west. How did you identify the target building? The compound matched the satellite imagery exactly. The target building was the largest structure, consistent with intelligence assessments that it served as a command and control center. Describe your weapon delivery. I used a single GBU-12 laser-guided bomb, released from a range of approximately 2 miles. The laser designator provided continuous guidance until impact. Warren studied the satellite photographs that showed the compound after the attack. The target building had been completely destroyed, and the secondary explosions had damaged several adjacent structures. The precision of the attack was evident in the fact that civilian buildings outside the compound had been left untouched. The weapon impact was extremely precise, she observed. How did you achieve that level of accuracy? Ma'am, I'd spent considerable time studying the target area using satellite imagery and intelligence reports. I'd identified the specific aim point and calculated the approach angle required for optimal weapon delivery. Had you practiced similar attacks during training? Yes, ma'am. I'd conducted numerous precision strike exercises using similar tactics and weapon systems. Warren made notes on her tablet, documenting the details of Elena's explanation. The debriefing would become part of the official record, used to analyze the mission and extract lessons that could be applied to future operations. Major Vasquez, she said, your mission has demonstrated that individual aircraft can accomplish objectives that larger formations cannot. That's a significant tactical insight that will influence how we plan future operations. Yes, ma'am. But it also raises questions about our intelligence assessments and mission planning processes. If you were able to identify tactical opportunities that our planning teams missed, then we need to understand how that happened and how we can prevent it from happening again. Elena chose her words carefully. Ma'am, I believe the intelligence assessment was accurate based on the information available. The tactical situation simply developed in ways that weren't anticipated during the planning process. But you anticipated it. You saw possibilities that the mission planners missed. I had the advantage of being in the tactical situation as it developed. I was able to assess the enemy's defensive response in real time and identify opportunities that weren't apparent during the planning phase. Warren nodded. That's a fair point, but it also suggests that our planning process might benefit from incorporating more diverse perspectives, including those of junior officers who might see possibilities that senior officers overlook. The implications were significant. Elena's mission had demonstrated that tactical innovation could achieve results that conventional approaches could not. But it had also shown that the military's hierarchical structure might sometimes prevent good ideas from being heard and implemented. Major Vasquez, Warren continued, I want you to understand that your mission will be studied extensively. Your tactical approach will be analyzed, your decision-making process will be documented, and your execution will be evaluated. The lessons learned will be incorporated into training programs and operational procedures. I understand, ma'am. But more importantly, your success will influence how we approach similar situations in the future. You've demonstrated that unconventional tactics can achieve conventional objectives, and that's a lesson that will have strategic implications. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the mission in exhaustive detail. Alina answered questions about her fuel consumption, her navigation techniques, her communication procedures, and her post-mission assessment. She explained her tactical thinking, her risk assessment, and her confidence in the mission's success. When the debriefing finally concluded, Warren packed up her materials and prepared to leave. But before she left, she had one final observation. "Major Vasquez," she said, "you've accomplished something remarkable today. You've shown that individual initiative and tactical innovation can achieve results that seemed impossible. That's a valuable lesson for the entire military." "Thank you, ma'am. But remember that with recognition comes responsibility. Your success will raise expectations, and you'll be expected to continue performing at this level. The military is investing in your development, and we expect that investment to pay dividends." Alina understood the message. Success brought opportunities, but it also brought pressure. She'd proven that she was capable of more than routine missions, but that meant she'd be expected to handle more challenging assignments. After the intelligence officers left, Alina returned to her quarters to complete her after-action report. The document would be her official account of the mission, the formal record of her decisions and actions. It would be reviewed by her superiors, analyzed by intelligence officers, and potentially used as a case study in military training programs. She sat at her desk, staring at the blank computer screen, trying to find the right words to describe what had happened. How did you explain the moment when everything you'd learned about flying and fighting came together in a single mission? How did you describe the feeling of being alone in hostile airspace, depending on your skills and your aircraft to accomplish something that everyone else had deemed impossible? She began to type, choosing her words carefully. The report would be read by officers who hadn't been in the cockpit, who hadn't faced the tactical situation she'd encountered, who hadn't had to make the decisions she'd made. She had to make them understand not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it. Mission Summary. On 15 October 2024, I participated in a planned strike mission against HVT-27 in the Kandahar province. When the primary mission was aborted due to unexpected enemy air defenses, I assessed the tactical situation and determined that an alternate approach might allow for mission completion. I executed a precision strike that resulted in the elimination of the target and the destruction of associated military infrastructure. It was clinical, professional, and accurate, but it didn't capture the reality of what had happened, the complexity of the decisions she'd made, or the significance of the results she'd achieved. The report would document the facts, but the story would be told in other ways. Over the next few days, Alina would be interviewed by journalists, debriefed by senior officers, and probably questioned by investigators who'd want to understand every aspect of her mission. She'd become a symbol of something: individual initiative, tactical innovation, or perhaps just the ability of one person to make a difference when it mattered most. But for now, she was just a pilot completing her paperwork, documenting her actions for the official record. The mission was complete, the target was eliminated, and the war would continue. Ghost 7 had accomplished her objective, and now it was time to prepare for whatever came next. The next morning brought a summons that Alina hadn't expected. She was ordered to report to the office of Brigadier General Patricia Morrison, the wing commander, at 800 hours. The meeting would be informal, the message said, But Alina knew that nothing involving a general officer was ever truly informal. She arrived at the appointed time, wearing her service uniform with the ribbon she'd earned during her 3 years of combat flying. The general's office was larger than Colonel Hartwell's, decorated with photographs from a career that had spanned 30 years and 3 wars. Behind the desk sat a woman who'd broken barriers, shattered stereotypes, and paved the way for pilots like Alina. "Major Vasquez," General Morrison said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down. I wanted to speak with you personally about your mission yesterday." Alina sat down, unsure what to expect. Conversations with general officers were rare events in a major's career, usually reserved for either very good news or very bad news. "I've read Colonel Hartwell's report," the general continued. "I've also spoken with the intelligence officers who debriefed you. What you accomplished was remarkable, and I wanted to congratulate you personally." "Thank you, ma'am. But I also wanted to discuss what happens next. Your mission has attracted attention at the highest levels of the Air Force. The Chief of Staff has been briefed on your actions, and there's considerable interest in understanding how you achieved what you did." Alina felt a flutter of nervousness. Attention from the Air Force's senior leadership could be either an opportunity or a problem, depending on how it was managed. "Ma'am, I simply executed a mission using the training and skills that the Air Force provided me." General Morrison smiled. "Major, don't be modest. What you did was exceptional by any measure. You demonstrated tactical innovation, sound judgment, and exceptional flying skills. Those are qualities that the Air Force values highly." "Yes, ma'am. I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment to the Pentagon as an aide to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. It's a position that will expose you to strategic-level planning and give you insight into how the Air Force develops and implements policy." Alina was stunned. A promotion and a Pentagon assignment were career-changing opportunities that most officers spent years working toward. The fact that they were being offered based on a single mission was almost overwhelming. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the opportunity, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." "Major, yesterday you proved that you're ready for responsibilities that most officers never face. You made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure and achieved results that seemed impossible. If you can handle that, you can handle anything the Pentagon can throw at you." The general stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where F-16s were preparing for the day's missions. "Major Vasquez, the Air Force is changing. We're facing new challenges that require new approaches. We need officers who can think independently, who can innovate under pressure, and who can achieve results when conventional methods fail." "Yes, ma'am. Your mission yesterday demonstrated all of those qualities. You saw possibilities that others missed, you executed a plan that others couldn't conceive, and you achieved results that others couldn't accomplish. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in positions of strategic responsibility." Alina understood the implications. Her career was about to change dramatically, moving from the tactical level of flying combat missions to the strategic level of planning and policy development. It was an opportunity that most officers would embrace without hesitation. But it was also a departure from the flying that had defined her identity as an Air Force officer. The Pentagon assignment would mean years away from the cockpit, years focused on paperwork and meetings rather than missions and aircraft. "Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'd prefer to remain in a flying assignment. I feel like I can make my best contribution in the cockpit." General Morrison turned back to face her. "Major, I understand your reluctance. Flying is what you know, what you love, and what you're good at. But the Air Force needs officers who can contribute at multiple levels. Your tactical experience will make you a better strategic planner, and your strategic experience will make you a better tactical leader." Yes, ma'am. Besides, this assignment won't be permanent. You'll spend 2 years in the Pentagon, gaining experience and exposure to senior leadership. Then you'll return to operational flying, probably as a squadron commander or maybe even as a wing operations officer. The prospect was tempting. Squadron command was the dream of every tactical pilot, the opportunity to lead other pilots and shape the direction of combat operations. But it seemed like a distant goal, something that might happen years in the future. Ma'am, what about my current squadron? They're deploying again in 6 months, and I'd like to be part of that deployment. Major, there will be other deployments, other opportunities to fly combat missions, but there won't be many opportunities to influence Air Force policy at the strategic level. This is a chance to make a difference on a larger scale. Alina considered the offer. The Pentagon assignment would be a significant step in her career, an opportunity to learn about the Air Force at the highest levels and to influence decisions that affected thousands of pilots. But it would also mean leaving behind the flying that had brought her to this point. Ma'am, may I have some time to consider the offer? Of course, but don't take too long. The Air Force moves quickly, and opportunities like this don't come around often. As Alina left the general's office, she felt the weight of the decision she faced. Her mission yesterday had opened doors that she'd never imagined, had created opportunities that most officers could only dream about. But it had also created expectations and pressures that she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. The next few hours would be crucial. She'd have to decide whether to embrace the opportunities that her success had created or to seek a more traditional path that kept her in the cockpit. Either choice would have consequences that would shape the rest of her career. But first, she had to understand exactly what she'd accomplished and what it meant for her future. The mission that had begun as a routine strike had become a turning point that would determine her trajectory in the Air Force. Ghost 7 had completed her objective, but Alina Vasquez was just beginning to understand what that accomplishment would mean. The news of Ghost 7's mission spread through the base like wildfire, carried by the informal network of pilots, maintainers, and support personnel who made up the community of people who kept combat aircraft flying. Within hours, every pilot on the base knew that Major Alina Vasquez had accomplished something extraordinary, had completed a mission that an entire strike package had been unable to do. The reactions were mixed. Some pilots were impressed by her tactical innovation and her successful execution of a challenging mission. Others were concerned about the precedent she'd set, worried that her example might encourage other pilots to freelance and ignore orders. A few were skeptical, wondering if her success had been more luck than skill. But among the younger pilots, especially the women who made up a small but growing percentage of the pilot force, Alina's mission was seen as something more significant than a tactical success. It was proof that competence and preparation could overcome the barriers of rank and gender, that results mattered more than politics or perceptions. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent graduate of pilot training who'd been assigned to the base just 3 months earlier, sought out Alina during the lunch break between debriefings. "Ma'am," she said, approaching Alina's table in the officers' club, "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday." Alina looked up from her sandwich, surprised by the interruption. "Thank me. I was just doing my job." Ayers that her actions had been the result of good judgment rather than recklessness, tactical thinking rather than insubordination. She'd have to show that she'd weighed the risks and benefits of her decision and concluded that the potential gains outweighed the potential costs. The debriefing would be lengthy and detailed, covering every aspect of the mission from takeoff to landing. Alina would be questioned by intelligence officers, operations officers, and probably a few senior commanders who'd want to understand how a relatively junior pilot had accomplished something that a full strike package had deemed impossible. But she was ready for those questions. She'd been preparing for them during the flight home, organizing her thoughts and rehearsing her explanations. She documented her decision-making process, her tactical assessment, and her execution of the mission. She'd prepared to defend her actions without appearing defensive. The most important thing she'd have to communicate was that her decision had been based on military judgment rather than personal ambition. She'd broken off from the formation not because she'd wanted to be a hero, but because she believed she could complete the mission. She'd continued to the target not because she'd wanted to prove herself, but because she'd seen an opportunity to accomplish the objective. Her call sign, Ghost 7, had been assigned to her randomly, based on her position in the flight and the squadron's naming convention. But now it seemed appropriate in a way that hadn't been obvious before. She'd become a ghost in the enemy's airspace, appearing and disappearing without warning, striking and vanishing before the defenders could react. The name would stick, Alina realized. From now on, she'd be known as the pilot who'd completed the impossible mission, who'd succeeded where others had failed, who'd turned a defeat into a victory through skill and determination. It was a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her career, for better or worse. But first, she had to explain herself to Colonel Hartwell and the other officers who'd been waiting for her return. She had to account for her actions, justify her decisions, and convince her superiors that she'd done the right thing for the right reasons. The meeting would be formal and professional, conducted in the same command center where they'd been monitoring her mission. Alina would stand at attention, present her report, and answer questions until her superiors were satisfied that they understood what had happened and why. She was ready for that meeting. She'd been preparing for it her entire career, learning to think independently while still following orders, to take initiative while still respecting authority, to make difficult decisions while still accepting responsibility for the consequences. The door to the command center opened, and Alina stepped inside, her helmet tucked under her arm and her flight suit still bearing the marks of her ejection seat. She looked around the room at the officers who'd been waiting for her return, saw the tactical displays that showed her route to and from the target, and felt the weight of their expectations. "Sir," she said, snapping to attention and addressing Colonel Hartwell, "Major Vasquez reporting as ordered." Colonel Hartwell looked at her for a long moment, and Alina could see him weighing his words carefully. What he said next would set the tone for everything that followed, would determine whether she was treated as a hero or a problem. "Major," he said finally, "I think we need to talk." Colonel Marcus Hartwell had been in the Air Force for 23 years, long enough to see combat in 3 different wars and to understand the difference between courage and recklessness. He'd commanded squadrons in Iraq and Afghanistan, had trained pilots who'd gone on to distinguished careers, and had investigated incidents that had ended careers and sometimes lives. He'd seen young pilots make brilliant decisions that saved missions and lives, and he'd seen them make stupid decisions that accomplished nothing but their own destruction. He'd learned to recognize the difference between calculated risks and pointless gambles, between tactical innovation and dangerous improvisation. What Major Vasquez had done fell somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Her decision to break off from the formation and continue to the target had been unauthorized, potentially dangerous, and completely successful. She'd violated standard operating procedures while accomplishing the mission objective. She'd acted independently while still serving the larger purpose. Hartwell's job was to figure out which aspect of her actions was more important, the violation of procedures or the success of the mission. He had to decide whether to recommend her for disciplinary action or for commendation, whether to treat her as a problem to be solved or an asset to be developed. The decision would depend on several factors: the quality of her judgment, the thoroughness of her preparation, and the soundness of her tactical thinking. If she'd gotten lucky, if she'd succeeded through chance rather than skill, then her actions would be viewed as reckless and inappropriate. If she'd succeeded through careful planning and superior execution, then her actions would be viewed as exemplary. The debriefing would be crucial. Hartwell would need to understand exactly how she'd assessed the tactical situation, how she'd calculated the risks and benefits of her decision, and how she'd executed the mission. He'd need to determine whether her success was repeatable or whether it had been a one-time event that couldn't be relied upon. He'd also need to consider the broader implications of her actions. If other pilots tried to emulate her example, would they be as successful? Or would they be more likely to get themselves killed while attempting something beyond their capabilities? The military operated on the principle that procedures existed for good reasons, that following orders was more important than individual initiative, and that the needs of the unit outweighed the desires of the individual. But it also operated on the principle that mission accomplishment was the ultimate goal, that results mattered more than methods, and that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. Major Vasquez had put those principles in conflict with each other. She'd violated procedures while accomplishing the mission, had acted independently while serving the larger purpose, had put herself at risk while eliminating a threat to others. Her actions had been both insubordinate and heroic, both dangerous and successful. Hartwell's job was to sort through those contradictions and reach a conclusion that would serve both the immediate needs of the military and the long-term development of the officer corps. He had to balance the need for discipline with the need for initiative, the importance of following orders with the importance of accomplishing missions. The meeting would be conducted in his office, a Spartan room decorated with photographs of aircraft and citations from his own career. Major Vasquez would sit across from his desk, flanked by her squadron commander and the intelligence officer who'd briefed the mission. The conversation would be recorded, transcribed, and forwarded to higher headquarters for review. Hartwell would begin by asking her to describe the mission from her perspective, to explain how she'd assessed the tactical situation and why she decided to continue to the target. He'd want to understand her decision-making process, her evaluation of the risks and benefits, and her confidence in her ability to complete the mission. He'd ask about her preparation, her knowledge of the target area, and her understanding of the enemy's defensive capabilities. He'd want to know whether she'd had specific information that led her to believe she could succeed where others had failed, or whether she'd been acting on instinct and training. Most importantly, he'd want to understand her motivations. Had she been trying to prove herself, to show that she belonged in the cockpit? Or had she been focused solely on the mission, on eliminating a threat that had been causing American casualties? The answers to those questions would determine how her actions were evaluated and what consequences would follow. If she'd been motivated by personal ambition, if she'd been trying to make a name for herself, then her actions would be viewed as selfish and inappropriate. If she'd been motivated by military duty, if she'd been focused on accomplishing the mission, then her actions would be viewed as commendable. But Hartwell suspected that the truth would be more complex than either of those alternatives. Major Vasquez struck him as a pilot who'd been underestimated, who'd been given routine missions because nobody had recognized her true capabilities. She'd probably been frustrated by the limitations placed on her, eager to prove that she could handle more challenging assignments. Her decision to continue to the target had probably been motivated by a combination of factors: military duty, personal ambition, and a desire to demonstrate that she belonged in the cockpit. She'd seen an opportunity to accomplish something significant, and she'd taken it despite the risks and despite the potential consequences. Whether that made her a hero or a problem remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: she'd changed the trajectory of her own career. From now on, she'd be known as the pilot who'd completed the impossible mission, who'd succeeded where others had failed. Her actions would be studied, analyzed, and probably emulated by other pilots who wanted to make their own mark. The military would have to decide whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, whether Major Vasquez's example should be encouraged or discouraged. The decision would depend on the quality of her judgment, the soundness of her tactical thinking, and the likelihood that other pilots could achieve similar results. But first, Hartwell had to understand exactly what had happened and why. He had to get the full story from the pilot who'd lived it, the complete picture of how one F-16 and one pilot had accomplished what 24 aircraft and 24 pilots had been unable to do. The debriefing would begin in 30 minutes, as soon as Major Vasquez had time to change out of her flight suit and collect her thoughts. Hartwell would have his answers then, and he'd be able to make his recommendations about what should happen next. But he already knew that whatever happened, Major Elena Vasquez would never again be viewed as just another pilot. She'd earned her place in the story, and now it was up to the military to decide what role she'd play in the chapters that followed. The intelligence assessment of the target area had been conducted over a period of 6 weeks, using satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human intelligence sources. The compound where Qasim al-Rashid had been located was a fortified position in the mountains north of Kandahar, surrounded by natural defenses and protected by surface-to-air missile sites. Intelligence had identified the compound as a high-value target after intercepting communications that suggested al-Rashid was planning a major attack against coalition forces. The intercepts had been corroborated by human intelligence sources who'd reported unusual activity in the area, including the movement of weapons and explosives. The mission had been planned as a precision strike using multiple aircraft to overwhelm the target's defenses. The strike package had included 24 F-16s armed with laser-guided bombs, supported by electronic warfare aircraft and refueling tankers. The mission had been designed to be quick, decisive, and overwhelming. But the mission planners had underestimated the enemy's defensive capabilities. The surface-to-air missile sites had been more numerous and better positioned than intelligence had indicated. The enemy's air defense network had been more sophisticated than anticipated, with multiple radar systems and overlapping coverage. When the strike package had encountered the unexpected defenses, the mission commander had made the correct decision to abort the mission. The risks had outweighed the potential benefits, and the likelihood of aircraft losses had been too high to justify continuing the attack. Major Vasquez had been flying in the number 4 position, far enough back in the formation to observe the tactical situation without being directly threatened by the enemy's defenses. She'd seen the SAM sites activate their targeting radars, watched the lead aircraft begin evasive maneuvers, and listened to the radio communications as the mission commander assessed the situation. But she'd also seen something that the mission commander hadn't: a gap in the enemy's defensive coverage that might allow a single aircraft to reach the target. The gap existed because the enemy's air defense systems were designed to counter a large formation of aircraft, not a single aircraft operating alone. The surface-to-air missiles had long-range capabilities but limited numbers. The radar systems had wide coverage but finite tracking capacity. The defensive positions had been optimized to counter a coordinated attack, not an individual aircraft operating independently. Major Vasquez had recognized that the enemy's strengths could also be their weaknesses. The defenses that were overwhelming for a large formation might be manageable for a single aircraft using different tactics. The radar systems that could track multiple targets might lose a single aircraft in the terrain clutter. Her decision to break off from the formation had been based on that tactical assessment. She'd calculated that the odds of success were better for a single aircraft than for the entire formation, that the risks were manageable if the approach was executed properly, and that the potential benefits justified the attempt. The approach she'd chosen had been unconventional but sound. Instead of following the planned route that would have taken her directly to the target, she'd used the terrain to mask her approach. She'd flown through valleys and over ridgelines, staying below the radar horizon and avoiding the known defensive positions. The route had been longer and more challenging than the direct approach, but it had also been less predictable. The enemy's defenses had been positioned to counter aircraft approaching from the expected directions, not from the circuitous route that Major Vasquez had chosen. Her navigation had been precise, relying on GPS coordinates and visual landmarks to maintain her position. She'd memorized the terrain features from satellite photos, identified the key navigation points, and planned alternative routes in case the primary route became compromised. The weapon delivery had been textbook perfect. She'd lined up her approach from the southeast, using the mountains as cover until the last possible moment. The laser-guided bomb had been released at the optimal range and angle, with the laser designator providing continuous guidance until impact. The secondary explosions had confirmed that the intelligence about an ammunition cache had been accurate. The destruction of the communications equipment had been verified by the loss of signals intelligence from the target area. The elimination of Qasim al-Rashid had been confirmed by multiple sources, including human intelligence assets who'd reported that he'd been in the compound at the time of the attack. The mission had been a complete success, accomplished by a single pilot in a single aircraft using tactics that weren't in any manual, but that had been perfectly suited to the tactical situation. Major Vasquez had turned a failed mission into a victory, and in the process, she demonstrated capabilities that nobody had previously recognized. But the success had raised questions that would have to be answered. Why had the intelligence assessment been incomplete? Why had the mission planners underestimated the enemy's defensive capabilities? Why had a junior pilot seen tactical possibilities that more senior officers had missed? The answers to those questions would determine how the military learned from the mission, how procedures were modified, and how similar situations were handled in the future. The success of Ghost 7's mission would be studied and analyzed, and the lessons learned would be incorporated into training programs and tactical doctrine. Major Vasquez would be at the center of those discussions. Her tactical decisions would be examined, her execution would be analyzed, and her judgment would be evaluated. She'd have to explain not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it and how other pilots might achieve similar results. The debriefing would be the beginning of that process. Colonel Hartwell would want to understand every aspect of the mission, from the initial tactical assessment to the final weapon delivery. He'd want to know how she'd made her decisions, how she'd executed her plan, and how she'd managed the risks. But the debriefing would also be an evaluation of Major Vasquez herself. Hartwell would be assessing her judgment, her tactical thinking, and her potential for future assignments. He'd be deciding whether she was ready for more challenging missions, whether she had the skills and temperament to handle increased responsibility. The conversation would be professional and thorough, covering every aspect of the mission in detail. Major Vasquez would be expected to provide complete and accurate information, to answer questions honestly and directly, and to accept responsibility for her actions and their consequences. She'd have to explain her decision-making process, her tactical assessment, and her execution of the mission. She'd have to demonstrate that her success had been the result of skill and preparation rather than luck and chance. She'd have to show that her actions had been appropriate for the situation and that the risks had been justified by the potential benefits.